Welcome, everybody, to the 2022 Ed Collab Spring Gathering. And I want to just take a minute to say thank you for everyone that has been participating today. And thank you very much to the people at Ed Collab for allowing me to present today on this topic that I'm very, very passionate about. As you can see that we're going to be talking about grammar today. Usually not one of the most fascinating topics that people want to learn about or people want to talk about. But again, as I said, this is very passionate to me. And so I want to take some of your time today and talk to you about how I reached my students in my classroom when I was actually teaching grammar. So bear with me today as I switch back and forth between the full screen of my presentation and when we're kind of looking at some documents today. So I want to make sure that all of you understand that and be prepared for that. So I hope all of you are having a really good conference and are enjoying this Ed Collab spring presentations that are coming to you. We're going to be talking about grammar today, as I said. And first, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jeremy Heiler. I am actually a manager of educational partnerships for the nonprofit Center for the Collaborative Classroom. You can check them out at a different time. I'm here to talk about grammar today, not about what I do for my job. Prior to becoming part of the Collaborative Classroom family, I was a middle school teacher for 21 years. Taught anywhere from grades 6 through 8 and taught mostly English. And I did teach some science in there as well. I can be found on Twitter at Jeremy B. Baller. So please follow me on Twitter and follow each other on Twitter. Make sure you're taking the time to follow anybody that you see is new, or if you connect with anybody through the spring conference here, make sure that you follow them. You can check out my website, a lot of resources that are on there. Information about this presentation will be on there. Usually takes me a couple days to get that up there, but I will also make sure that you have a link at the end of this presentation to the slideshow. And I think the recording will be made available to you as well. You can email me at any time at elmaballer40@gmail.com. That is my personal email, and you can go ahead and email me with any questions about anything that you see today, or maybe next steps for your students as you are thinking about what you want to do with the presentation that I'm giving you today. So without further ado, because it's enough about me, let's talk about what we need to get to today. Let's talk about some grammar. But before we get into that, I wanted you to take a few minutes here, and I want you to think about what are the issues that teachers face today with teaching grammar and writing. What are those issues that are commonly faced by teachers, or if you are a middle school teacher yourself, or even if you're not a middle school teacher, I mean, elementary teacher, the lesson or the activity that I'm going to show you today can be adapted for high school. It can be adapted for elementary school, even though it does have that middle school focus. But take a minute, write down in your journal, if you have a journal next to you, or if you're taking notes on a Google Doc, go ahead and think about what are the issues that are facing teachers today. All right, as you're writing those things down and you're thinking about the issues that face them, or maybe you're thinking of some things in your own mind in terms of what are some of those issues, I just want to share with you some of the things that are often said to me as I have presented this in years past, and I continue to present on teaching grammar in a digital age to educators. Some of the things that a lot of teachers come to me and we have this conversation at the beginning of my presentations. It's usually about they can't get grammar to stick with students. They have trouble with students being able to get them to carry over the activities that they do with their students and carry that over into their writing. They tend to just struggle with that with their students. And I hear that over and over and over from times that I've presented. And so, I want to be able to help teachers. And, I'm not an expert necessarily. I'm not the expert. There are many experts out there in the grammar world, and we'll talk about some of those experts a little bit later on in the presentation. But, I want to be able to help and guide teachers in terms of getting those grammar lessons to stick. And so as you think about what are some other issues that might be facing teachers besides grammar, is thinking about how is it that I can design my own lessons to help students be able to get that. One of the other issues that teachers usually come to me with too, as well, is the idea that they don't have the basic skills that they need when they come into a classroom. And some of those things might be capitalization skills, punctuation skills, and so they quickly turn to this argument that there's some other things going on, and usually that argument has to deal with technology, and we're going to get to that today as well. So just I want to make sure that we're thinking about those issues that plague us as teachers, or plague teachers today. So some initial thoughts as we go through this presentation today is that I am not an advocate, and I will strongly argue with evidence that grammar instruction should not be taught in isolation. And that's where we're going to be going with things today. As educators, we need to respect the spaces in which our students write from day to day. A lot of times I hear teachers and I hear educators complain about the fact that students in general don't have the skills because they spend so much time in their own writing spaces that they are struggling when it comes to writing in the classroom. Yes, students do spend a lot of time in their own writing spaces. There is no doubt about that, and I will not argue that point at all. However, we have to be able to help our students identify when is it okay to be able to not capitalize a letter, or when is it okay to not use punctuation. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is when is it okay to be informal in their writing versus formal in their writing. And so we'll dive deeper into that today as well. And then the other initial thought that I have here is learning and using grammar is a lifelong skill. Students will not be able to learn all grammar skills in a K-12 setting. I want you to think about your own grammar skills. Do you know all of the grammar skills in the English language? Because I know at 44 years old that I don't know every single rule, and I forget things from time to time. I've written and co-authored books, and I know that when they've come back from editing, there are things that are on there. I'm like, yep, I didn't even see that, or I made that mistake, and it might be the same mistake I've made over and over and over again. So there are struggles that we have even as adults. I don't think that there's anybody that's perfect in terms of learning every grammar skill and being able to apply every grammar skill to their writing. And finally, students will not get grammar to stick, as I mentioned in our last slide, in terms of this is what teachers come to me with, unless they see applicable ways to use it. Students have to be able to see purpose. They have to be able to see the why behind what they're learning. And so that is what I'm hoping to get across to you today as we go through this lesson and in these activities. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background, one of the things that I like to follow, or that I have followed in the past as a teacher, is Liz Kolb's Triple E framework. And you can see the link right there on your screen. Liz does an amazing job. She is a professor now at the University of Michigan, and she has done a phenomenal job in terms of this framework for implementing technology into our classroom. And these three main areas, which are extend, enhance, and engage. And I'm not going to go through and read the screen to you because you can do that. But one of the things that I always like to share with participants in any of my workshops or in any of my presentations is that this extend piece, in terms of does it allow the students to be able to create a bridge between school learning and everyday life experiences. Students have to be able to see things that are actually going on in their lives and be able to see that it's applicable, just like I mentioned in the last slide. That has to be that point to where it sticks. When they can see that it's something that can apply to their own life, or they can see it out in the real world, it's more likely that it's going to stick with them. So I encourage you to check out Liz's work. It is a fantastic website. And I also encourage you to check out her Learning First, Technology Second, where she goes into some specific examples for students in terms of with student examples in terms of how to use technology in the classroom. Because after all, technology should be something that enhances us in our classroom. It shouldn't be something that we use just because it's fancy and it's nice and it's cool for our students. Yes, we like to have cool things in our classroom, and in some instances there is always that element of entertainment, but we want to make sure that we put technology as we put the students in the center and technology is second, and this is a really good book to do that. So just to give you a little bit of a brief history of grammar, and don't worry, I'll make sure that I do this in a manner that you won't fall asleep, as it says here on the slide. But grammar has been debated for hundreds of years. And I just had this conversation the other day with some of my colleagues that this has just been something that has always been a struggle in terms of how should we approach students and how should we get grammar across to students. And the question has always been, should we explicitly teach grammar in English class? Meaning, should we teach it in isolation? Well, in 1963, there was an NCTE research, and this study was done for written composition. And in this study, they learned that teaching formal grammar instruction doesn't improve composition. So in other words, if, putting it in terms that so that I can understand, is that teaching grammar in isolation wasn't improving grammar skills at all in the writing for students. And so we have to make sure that we are teaching it in a different way. So the other question came up after this report was, well, should we be working with students to learn grammar in context? Well, in 1985, NCTE passed a resolution that said, yes, there is research that supports that when you teach grammar in context, that it is tending to stick more than what it would if we were to teach it in isolation. So this resolution passes, and this has been a position statement ever since for NCTE. Now, the question is, are there other paths? Perhaps there are. We throw technology into this mix, and then we start thinking, is technology at fault for all of this? Do we have to think about, reteaching our students all over again because technology is causing problems? So we have some things to think about here when it comes to teaching grammar. But there's the brief history of grammar. One of the things that I tend to do with my students is that I lean towards a program with my students called Grammar Flip, just to kind of kick things off here today in terms of thinking about, what should we have students do? Grammar Flip is not the end all be all. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Grammar Flip today, just because you can go and check Grammar Flip out on your own. Very low cost, low budget in terms of your own budget. I think it's something that teachers can afford out of their own pocket, or it's something that you can go to your administration. You can talk to your administration about getting some licenses for students. Pretty inexpensive. Anyways, Grammar Flip is just what it says. It's flipping the lessons for grammar. And I always have started my students off with this at the beginning of the week. We go in and we look at lessons together, and they have it tiered. They have different tiers in Grammar Flip, where they have basic skills, they have some mid-tier skills, which are more geared towards middle school, and they have some higher level skills in their third tier for high schoolers. And you can, present that to your students however you want to. I always gave my students a week to look at the lesson, and we usually looked at it together at the beginning of the week. And what I wanted my students to do is I wanted to be able to have them have a resource. This was made for a resource, and this gave them some additional practice. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, isn't this isolation? Isn't this teaching grammar in isolation? No, not necessarily, because with the way Grammar Flip does it is you're asking your students to look at the lesson on their own time, and then you're spending more time in your classroom kind of dissecting the lesson itself. And there are some multiple choice questions and quizzes that the students can take. There's lots of progress monitoring with this, but this is just a piece of the puzzle that I always did in my classroom. And so I want to make sure that I'm clear on that. This was a resource for students to go back and have additional practice if they needed additional practice. we still talked about the lesson together in class. We still looked at videos together in class, even though I had assigned them to look at the video on their own. We always practiced together, and then I had the students go and do the lessons or do the quizzes on their within class, as we dissected some additional sentences or sentence structure or punctuation or whatever the lesson might have been for that week. So going back to this argument, as we talk about technology and using technology, because I just introduced a piece of technology to you, is should this idea of technology or texting, is it to blame for students having poor grammar? The reason why I put this slide in here after talking to you for a few minutes about Grammar Flip was because I want to keep this in the forefront of your mind. I want you to keep thinking about, is technology really the reason why students are struggling with grammar? The simple answer is no, ladies and gentlemen, they're not. It is not, and they're not struggling with it because of technology. But one of the things I wanted to point you to was Kristen Holly-Turner's research that she's done, and this quote here that simply says, and I'm going to read this, but it says, "For the digital generation, DigiTalk is standard practice." And we need to allow our students, and so I read that first part to you, but we need to allow our students, and we need to give teens that space and the tools to communicate in ways, because they're discovering who they are, and that's value to them. And so we need to make sure that we are giving them that space. Remember, at the very beginning, I mentioned about how we need to make sure that we honor the spaces that our students write in. So we shouldn't be yelling at students because they don't capitalize their I's, or we shouldn't be yelling at students because they don't punctuate. Yes, it's frustrating. I get it. I did it for 21 years, so I know exactly how you feel as a teacher in terms of getting those final papers and you're like, I told you to capitalize your I's, and you want to pull your hair out. But this is not the time to get frustrated with students. This is the time to help to teach them the difference between formal and informal. So piggybacking off from using something like Grammar Flip, that is helping students to distinguish between that formal and informal. And we're going to dive deeper into that now. So here is something I want to show you, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to I'm going to undo the presentation so we can look at this a little bit closer. But this is what is called, I call it grammar hacking with my students. And so what I give my students is I give my students this Google slide that I have created. And I have adapted this slide over the years, and I truly hope that you take this slide and you adapt it to how you want to use it. But what I want to go over with you is that you introduce this slide with your students and you have a conversation with them about the different spaces that they write in. As you can see, for middle school, I have chosen 6 different spaces for them to write in. This might be a bit much for an elementary student. I might narrow it down to like 3 spaces. For a high school student, they could do well. Even for middle school, maybe you can narrow it down to 4 if you feel more comfortable for 4. Maybe for 6th grade, it's 4, and for 7th grade, it's 5, 8th grade. I've done, with 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I've done as many as 6. But anyways, going into this, this Google slide, we call it grammar hacking. But what we do first is we have a conversation together in class. And this conversation is around the different spaces. And what I'm asking students to do is say, okay, so what does it mean to be a formal writer and an informal writer? So we go into these definitions and we talk about these definitions with being informal. And talking about informal means that I'm talking to, or I'm writing to a friend. I could be writing to a family member. I could be informal with a family member if I wanted to. Probably more or less, it might be a brother, a sister, or maybe a parent. I might write informal. But informal just means that I'm probably not following all of the grammar rules. I'm not following all the English language rules in terms of sentence structure, those types of things. And then we get into the discussion about formal writing, and formal writing is dealing with pieces that I'm going to turn into my teacher, pieces I might turn into to an employer if I have a job. So I want to make sure all of those grammar rules are followed. I want to make sure I'm following sentence structure, capitalization, punctuation, all of those things. So we have a general conversation about these different spaces. And students usually say that Google Document is for formal writing. Snapchat is probably going to be informal. And like I said, you might want to adapt this to how your students, the different spaces that your students write in. You might have Instagram. I know that TikTok is one of those things that are popular. And I don't know, there is writing that you can put on the screen for TikTok videos, but there might be something that you can have a conversation with your students about. I think if you just you initiate the conversation about the different spaces, that in itself is going to show you that you respect the spaces that they write in. And that's super important for you as a teacher, because when you can show the students that you recognize and you respect the spaces they write in, they're going to start to understand that, hey, it's okay that I write like this here in this space, this informal space like Twitter or Snapchat or texting, but it's also going to get them and propel them to know that when it comes to a formal space, they need to make sure they're watching a little bit more closely what they're doing. So one of the fascinating conversations I've had with students in the past is around like texting and email, and those two in particular in terms of whether it's formal or informal. And what's fascinating is students go, well, Mr. Heiler, or they used to say, Mr. Heiler, it really depends on your audience. Oh, you're right. So you're starting to think about who your audience is in terms of whether you should be formal or informal. So if I'm texting my grandmother or texting an aunt that I haven't talked to in a long time, it's probably going to be wise for me to be formal. Or if I'm emailing my teacher about the assignments that I missed when I was absent, I'm probably going to want to be formal. I'm not going to want to start out by saying, hey, brah, I need to get my assignments from you. Probably not a good idea. I want to be more formal. So we have that initial conversation around this particular slide, just so students get an idea of the different spaces. And then I get a little bit more specific with them, with how they're going to do this template. And so what I'm going to show you now is a Google document, and hopefully you can see this Google document well, again, called Grammar Hack. So what is the objective to this? The objective is to learn, the students are going to learn to differentiate in writing spaces. They typically write daily or weekly, whether those spaces are formal or informal. And I want them to learn how to apply these new grammar skills through the spaces. We'll talk about the application process a little bit more here in a few minutes. This usually takes anywhere between 2 to 3 class periods. This will probably take you a little bit longer at the beginning, but the more you do this with your students throughout the year, I think it picks up a little bit. You can see I kind of made a little note there. It says first time may take up to 4 class periods. I already talked about day one with you in terms of making sure that you are spending time talking about the different social platforms that they write on, the different spaces, and this differentiation between formal and informal writing. And then you have this tool, Grammarflip, that I talked to you briefly about, and you can go back in the recording and listen to me talk a little bit about Grammarflip. Then when we get into the meat and potatoes of this, what I have my students do is we are looking at a mentor sentence. Jeff Anderson, who is the author of Mechanically Inclined, does a lot of work with mentor sentences. And this is where I got this idea from. And he is one of my mentors, and I love Jeff dearly. I think he is an awesome, awesome teacher, or when he was in the classroom. He was an awesome teacher, but he always talked about these mentor sentences. And this is a mentor, this sentence in bold is a mentor sentence that comes from Behind Rebel Lines by Seymour Wright. And this was an 8th grade text that I had my students read. It was a nonfiction text. And so we were looking at adverbs and adjectives. So we were using this as our mentor sentence so that students can see how authors are using different parts of grammar. So again, you can see we've already talked about the fact that it's using adjectives and adverbs, but then students are going to use this grammar skill and they're going to apply it by rewriting this mentor sentence. And so I always have students start off by working with partners. I think that's really important. So I'm going to go back here just for a moment. So when students are working with partners, what they're trying to do is they're trying to create this these different sentences within these different social media spaces, these different spaces that they write in. So you can see that here in the Google Doc, and I do suggest going through and doing this together first before you release students to do it in pairs. But you can see that this Google Doc, I just have them write down the mentor sentence. And then you can see with the old version of Snapchat how students rewrote the sentence where they said party at the CH, all supplies you need. And then you can see how they wrote it in a text message. And I'm not going to go through and read each one of these to you, but you can see how with this student example, how they went through and they rewrote this. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, I have to point this one out because this is my favorite, but you can see that they went through and they actually did some really, I felt like smart alecky responses to this, but it just says in our attempts to make substantial revisions to the sample sentence from Behind Rebel Lines, a fine book by Seymour Wright. We have encountered some challenges and opportunities as a team. However, we feel that this version adequately represents our efforts. I thought this was awesome for eighth graders to write because I just don't see eighth graders ever writing like this, but I told them the reason why I really like this as an example is because this is formal writing, and this really can distinguish the difference between formal and informal. And then you can see with the Twitter how they use the hashtags and they use the different usernames with the @ symbol. You can see in Facebook they use hashtags as well. So there's different ways that you can do, you can have students show how to write in those spaces. And again, if students aren't using Twitter, maybe Twitter is not the one to go with. Maybe you go with a different space for them to write. So I wanted to just show you another quick example. When Instagram, this is the old version of Instagram, they used a puzzle piece for compound sentences in terms of thinking about that idea that you have to have a coordinating conjunction to connect two similar ideas. So you can check this out on your own. One extension you can do of this is you can have students write out what the rule is in their own language down here at the bottom, as you can see. Hopefully you can see that. I'll move this up just a little bit, and then that official rule, and then writing it in their own words. So here's a couple of examples. I'm just going to go back real quick to this one. Again, you can see how students would work this. In a longer workshop, if I was doing this as a workshop in person, or we were doing this, I would, in a Zoom meeting, we were live, then I would have breakout rooms. So if you're doing anything remotely with students, you can always have them do breakout rooms with this. One of the things that I've done with students is I've broken it down. This is just one other way I wanted to show you. I've broken it down with students in terms of giving them just one of those media platforms and then giving them that mentor sentence and showing them that this is informal. So what would it look like in an informal setting? You can break it down like that. This is also really good for elementary students as well. So if you wanted to break it down like that for elementary students. So as we think about doing that activity, and actually I'm going to go back one more time. I'm going to go back to this slide because this is some directions that you can give to students, but also there's some links here on this slide. So you can click on those links. I just want to keep this up for a minute while I'm talking, so you can actually, if you want to write those links down, they're bit.ly links. And again, I'll make sure that you have copies of, or you'll have access to this presentation. So you can go to those grammar templates, and you can also go to the template instructions. You just need to make sure you make copies of those because they're view only. So please make sure you're making copies of them. That way you can see them and use them in your classroom. Because if you have view only, you're only going to be able to view it, and you can't use it. So make sure you make a copy. You have my permission to make a copy of that. So going back to this idea of other content areas, one of my former colleagues who is still in the classroom used this template in a little bit of a different way. So if you are thinking about, well, how can I get literacy into, or how can I get other content areas? Because literacy is everyone's responsibility. You've probably heard that before, but how am I going to get other teachers? How can I help my other content area teachers? One of the ways that one of my former colleagues used this was he used this template as a way to have students take notes on a video. So he knew that they were paying attention to this video. And so there's some really really cool things that they did here with pictures and the informal writing with the texting. And again, giving students the opportunity to write in their own spaces and giving them the respect to write in their own spaces. So you might be thinking that all this is really good. You're like, hey, this is great. I love this, but how is this apply? How are they going to apply this to their own writing? So I talked about Grammar Flip at the beginning in terms of those basic skills and having that resource for students to kind of always go back to it in terms of practicing. They're practicing and they're looking at mentor sentences in our own books that we were reading. And then they're using their own spaces to write. So they're seeing real world application. Plus, it's helping them to differentiate between that formal and informal writing spaces, or those formal and informal writing spaces. Now that they've had lots of practice, now how do they apply it? Well, now, so if you have that expository essay, you have that argument essay, you have that narrative essay, whatever you're working on with your students, now you can have your students show you what they've learned. So in this instance, when we were talking about, I'm just going to go back to the slide, when we were talking about adjectives and adverbs, now when students are using adjectives in that really robust narrative that you're having them write, now what you can have them do is you can have them highlight in blue, green, pink, whatever color you desire, highlight 5 adjectives for me, highlight in green, highlight 5 adverbs in yellow, whatever the color. If you're working on compound sentences, highlight 3 compound sentences or use 3 compound sentences and highlight them so I can see that you're using them effectively. So you can have you can create that key for them. So they're then applying it to their formal writing skills. And then that's how the application part of it works. I have done that. I had done this for many, many years. I would say probably 6, 7 years prior to leaving the classroom. And I was seeing some awesome results from my students because number one, they were getting to practice with the basic skills that teachers typically say that they don't have when they come in the classroom through using Grammar Flip. Number two, they were getting lots of practice through the mentor texts, looking at mentor texts with the grammar template, or the grammar hacking is what I call it. And I was also respecting the spaces that they originally write in every day, or that they write in every day. So using those 3 things and them understanding the difference between formal and informal spaces, they were then able to apply it to more of a formal piece of writing and say, okay, now that I know this is formal, I have to write this way. And then obviously you have your peer editing, your peer revising, you have all that stuff that's going on in your classroom. So lots of things to think about here when we are doing a grammar template. So again, this was something that was done in a science classroom where the science teacher had taken notes. But the ultimate question I have for you as we conclude today is, what is next for you? What are your next steps that you have that you want to do for learning this grammar template? Do you want to implement it right away? Do you have more questions for me? Is there something that do you want to take this back to your department meeting and say, hey, I learned this really great thing over the weekend. This is something that we might be able to use even this year before our school year's up, or this is something I'd like to implement next year. There's lots of different things that you can think about here. So I'm curious in terms of what your next steps are. So maybe write that down again in that space that you have, that journal, that Google document. What are you thinking at this point? What more do you want to know? How do you see this fitting into your own classroom? So regardless of whether you use this or not, I do want to say thank you for your time today. I do really appreciate the fact that I am able to present and show you a way that worked wonders for me in my classroom, and feel free to adapt it any way that you would like to use it. And again, I just want to say thank you for EdCollab for allowing me to present, and I hope all of you have a great day, and you continue to learn lots as we continue through the rest of our conference. So take care, everybody.